Everything went wrong for her devoted canine on the most important day of her life. Initially, the guests were shocked when she abruptly obstructed her passage down the aisle. She was unaware of what was going on, but what was disclosed a short while later transformed her life. Forever. Put the sun streamed through Amalia's bedroom's gauze white drapes. It was a lovely morning that ought to have been full with warmth and golden glow on the polished hardwood floor. In just 1 week, she would be standing in front of her loved ones filled with nothing but joy and expectation. It was the moment she had been dreaming of for years, the result of years of deliberate decisions, when she vowed her love and dedication to Daniel, and optimistic hopes after meeting Daniel at a business function 2 years before. Despite her lack of excitement, she had left the event feeling he had been charming, confident, and totally relaxed. In Athrong, his words were infused with wisdom. His smile had been a silent pledge, and they connected right away. And Amalia experienced something for the first time in her life, felt she had found someone who really cared for her. He was prosperous and well-liked. Her mother loved the lawyer's easy elegance and perfect manners. Even her co-workers, who don't often say that, complimented her on her good fortune, delved into her private life and made remarks about how well they appeared. But as she gazed at the bridal gown draped close to the window, an unexplainable shade in the light of what ought to have been pure, was the feeling of disquiet that twisted in the pit of her stomach. She attempted to shake it off by attributing it to her pre-wedding jitters. It's common to be nervous before a life-altering event, isn't it, Gentle? She turned when she heard rustling behind her and spotted Knox, her devoted German shepherd. His ears were perked up as he watched her from his normal location at the foot of the bed. He had been acting oddly for a while, and his amber eyes were fixed on her. Knox was more than simply a pet for weeks now, ever, since the wedding preparations had reached their last phase, was her guardian and dependable friend at her life's highs and lows. 6 years before, she had taken him in as a clumsy puppy, full of their unrelenting dedication and boundless energy, had created an unbreakable. No one she had brought into her life had ever experienced violence from Bond and him. Till first, it had been subtle. KNX would just quietly observe Daniel's intensity every time he came, and you could never really unwind in his company before the gentle growls began. Barely perceptible, but enough to alert Amalia that Daniel had dismissed it with a chuckle, made fun of it at first by accusing KNX of being too cautious. But as the weeks went by, if Daniel kissed her KNX, the dog's discomfort would only become worse, and he would sit between them any time they were near one another, would repeatedly stand with his ears back and tail stiff after baring his fangs. Amalia had attempted to reassure him, not in a hostile manner, but in a warning soothe him, but nothing seemed to calm him down. Daniel, however, had a few nights earlier. Knox shook his head and remarked, "I'm jealous and I'm getting impatient. Saw them from the other side of the living room. Maybe we need to arrange for him to temporarily relocate till the wedding is over." Amalia was hesitant to go without knocking, even for a little period of time. She was uncomfortable with time, but Daniel had been so tolerant and rational. He smiled as he added forever to avoid ruining her special day. Had grudgingly consented, but when she woke up that night, Knox was there. Standing at her bedroom door, his tight body language served as a subtle threat. Even after she had summoned him, he had remained still. She attempted to ignore the thoughts she needed to just now as she looked back at her image in the mirror. As she stretched out to touch him, her thoughts remained on the wedding and the life she was about to start with Daniel. She couldn't help but notice the lace of her wedding dress, the nagging doubt at the back of her mind, or the way Knox's, her eyes were fixed on her, intensely focused on something she couldn't exactly identify. Amalia, as she sat at her kitchen table, gazing at the unfinished coffee, the rich aroma of roasted beans filled the air in front of her, blending with the subtle aroma of morning dew that permeated the open window. It ought to have been a little period of calm before the chaos of wedding planning took underway the day, but she was distracted by an uneasy feeling that she couldn't seem to tremble Knox, who was lying at her feet with his head resting on his big paws. His body was tight as if he were sleeping, and his ears perked at every little sound. Were waiting for anything since he had been acting like way for days. with his typical liveliness being replaced by Amalia bent down and rubbed her fingers over his thick fur in a silent vigilance, hoping he exhaled slowly to calm him, but he didn't relax. It wasn't only something about Knox had changed during the last week. He was no longer roaring and had started behaving. He would place himself between them upright, as if Daniel were a thread. When Daniel approached the dog too closely, he would stiffen his body into a barrier. The dog had always been calm and cooperative, but began disobeying orders when they required moving away from Daniel on a few instances, he flatly refused to leave the room when instructed to do so. And last night, she was in bed. Knox had been in the bedroom just about to fall asleep when she was startled awake by a deep gutter growl. Door, peering at something in the dark with his low ears back. The light outside the hallway was on, creating a lengthy shadow on the floor, yet nothing seemed out of place. Yet KNX stayed still and didn't move. His tense limbs tensed as Amalia muttered his name. But when she discovered him curled up the next morning, he had hardly recognized her when she had attempted to enter the closet where Daniel kept some of his belongings. He hesitated to call him away, his gaze darting between her and the clothing. She had dismissed it internally, attributing it to some odd intuition or the strange smell of a guy who didn't dwell in her flat permanently, but now, observing Knox's constant stress while seated at the table, she wasn't so, undoubtedly. Daniel's response hadn't helped. His remarks were absurd. He shook his head and smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. You must establish limits, Amalia. She had agreed that he couldn't decide who could be near you. At least she had said that she did, but there was more to it than that. She felt uneasy with the way he had put it. He was irritated because there was a deeper feeling of. She jumped a little when she heard a knock on the door, and KNX raised his head. His ears went hard at once, and she moaned, pushing herself to Lauren. Stood on the other side as I opened it after getting over my nervousness. Brad woke up with a dubious expression on her face, sunglasses on her head, and a hot cup of coffee in one hand. To be, she murmured, entering before Amalia could even give her a decent greeting. Since college, Lauren had been her closest friend and the one person who could read her like a book. It was a gift, and depending on the circumstances, a curse. Today it seemed more like you seem to have not slept, Lauren noticed as she put down her coffee. Amalia responded, putting her jacket away, and hoped it would ease her wedding-related worry, be sufficient justification. Lauren wasn't persuaded, so she looked down at Knox, who was now seated. I'm silently observing her. Isn't that Amalia the dog? He's been behaving strangely recently, snarling at Daniel, and he paused before nodding. Lauren's brows are wrinkled. Maybe he detects something. He follows him with his gaze as if he's waiting for something to happen. Amalia laughed a little, as if to say, What? I'm going to marry a guy he doesn't approve of. Lauren, who leaned against the counter rather than laughing. Taking into account that dogs can sense things that humans cannot, I once read about. It turns out that the man was cheating on the lady whose dog would not stop snarling at her fiancé. Amalia rolled her eyes and said, Her animals just know. Knox isn't psychic, but he's Lauren, who is protective, said that if he believes anything is wrong with Daniel, perhaps you need to hear the words that weighed her down like a burden she hadn't been expected because she had been secretly considering the same thing. And later that night, when Lauren had left Amalia, she didn't want to acknowledge it, discovered herself absently petting Knox's hair while Daniel was. He seemed calm as ever as he sat across from her going through his phone. His dark blue shirt and his hair were neat. He was well dressed, so why did she sense that something wasn't right? Had persuaded herself over the previous 2 years that Daniel was everything she desired. Charming, bright, and responsible. But now that she was staring at him, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been too quick to believe in his perfection. Knox's ears twitched as he abruptly raised his head, got to his feet, and went slowly and deliberately approaching Daniel, looking up to see what Knox had halted. He didn't bare his fangs or snarl in front of him. Instead, he just gazed and, for the first time, Amalia saw something strange in Daniel's gaze. There was a brief glimpse of something in Daniel's face that didn't quite fit. The well-put-together picture, he consistently conveyed annoyance rather than anything more sinister. As he leaned down to scratch behind Knox's ears, it vanished in an instant and was replaced with a laugh. Knox still dislikes me. Knox didn't stir, so Daniel grumbled and got to his feet. He bent down and said, I should stretch because my big day is coming up. I tried to catch some sleep by kissing Amalia's forehead before she could respond. Automatically nodded while continuing to observe Knox, who had slightly moved his head. As soon as the door clicked shut behind them, Daniel followed him. Knox growled, softly and slowly, warning, and Amalia wasn't sure she could disregard it for the first time. The wedding morning came with a spooky silence. The sun had just begun to rise, sending a faint golden glow over the horizon, and the only sound coming from the home was the rustling of cloth. Amalia sat in front of a big screen while listening to the soft murmur of conversations from another room. As the makeup artist gently brushed a brush over her, the vanity mirror saw. The lady was discussing how dazzling brides always had a particular shine, but Amalia's cheeks wasn't paying attention. Her thoughts were elsewhere, entangled in the discomfort that had been deeply ingrained in over the last 2 weeks. Knox has been lying curled up at the foot of the chair with her stomach. He hadn't left her side all day, and Amber's eyes were riveted on her image in the mirror, morning moving only when she did, and his presence is now typically consoling, seemed to serve as a reminder or an implicit caution that she was attempting to disregard the bridal gown, hanging on the work of art with beautiful white lace on the other side of the room. Everything about the needlework, from the delicate beading on the bodice to the way the cloth fell in gentle waves, was just as she had imagined it, had meticulously planned this day for months, paying close attention to every detail, to ensure that everything was perfect. But as she sat there, as she looked at her own image, she couldn't help but question if Lauren had been correct. Knox had been correct. But what should she do now that the visitors were? Her mother was giddy with anticipation when she arrived at the location. The officer was most likely going over his notes in order to be ready for a ceremony that would start in less than an hour. She was unable to just leave her thoughts since a second after the knock on the door, her mother appeared in her eyes. She lit up as she saw Amalia wearing her silk bridal gown. You look so beautiful, my love. She sighed in delight as she entered, saying, beautiful. The day is finally here and I can't believe it. Amalia forced a grin, thinking it would be in order to conceal the escalating turmoil inside her. Her mother approached and smoothed a hand over her shoulder. I understand that. You're anxious, but every bride experiences this. Gets cold feet. She chuckles a little. I can recall having the same reaction when I married your father. But, as soon as I went down the aisle, I realized that Amalia wanted to think that she wanted to be precisely where I was meant to be, to think that all she was experiencing was just the normal jitters that preceded such a large dedication. But she knew in her heart that when the door opened once again, this time it was Lauren who was wearing a rich burgundy-red bridesmaid gown that well complemented her skin, yet even though she looked magnificent, her face was cautious, measured, quietly evaluating waiting while keeping an eye on Amalia all morning. Lauren said, looking at her, we need to start getting you into your dress. The clock indicates that the automobile would arrive in 20 minutes. Amalia gave a mechanical nod. As she rose, she ran her hands over the material of her robe. But KNX Lauren and her mother turned to face her as she let out a deep, piercing growl. Amalia halted, looking at her mother as she frowned and questioned, what's wrong with the dog? Knox was looking at the door with his ears pricked up and his body tight, and he was growling. His hackles were still rumbling deep in his chest, rising a little before she could respond. Another tap came, this time more firmly, impatiently. Amalia. It was me. Knox's growl erupted into a piercing bark, and his whole stance changed when Daniel's voice asked from the other side, May I come in? Amalia's heart lurched not before he shifted as if he were getting ready for a battle. It's bad luck you, her mother muttered as she hurried to the door during the ceremony. Understand that I just need to speak with her for a moment. Daniel said that it wouldn't take. Amalia gulped for a moment, looking at Lauren. Her friend's face was inscrutable, but her gaze shifted from Amalia to Knox and back again. It wasn't an excellent idea, but Amalia nodded nevertheless. She said that her mother hesitated for a little while. Lauren remained as steadfast as Amalia before he sighed and moved aside. Daniel walked across the room, opened the door, and stood there with a perfect suit and a perfect face. Was kind and had an easy grin, yet something in the back of his eyes made her, "I just wanted to see you," he murmured, feeling his gut clench. "I know it's unlucky, but I had to gaze at you before everything else happened." Nevertheless, Knox was still snarling and refused to back down while standing right between them. Daniel's jaw tightened as his eyes shifted to the dog. "Are we still dealing with this?" he whispered to Amalia. Daniel sighed slightly and shook his head, asking, "What do you mean?" "Been behaving strangely for weeks, Amalia. Perhaps it's time for us to realize that this isn't." Something about his tone, which was so contemptuous and irritated, made her feel normal, tightening of the chest. Or maybe he saw something she didn't say before she stopped. For a brief moment, Daniel's gaze briefly met her own, flashed there something icy, then vanished almost as fast as it reached up and replaced it with his typical easy grin. "You're nervous," he murmured. "It's just wet and jitters when you touch her face." Her skin scorched where his. When fingers touched her for the first time, she became aware that she didn't want. She turned when he touched her and placed a gentle but strong hand on her shoulder, anchoring her. A little, and saw Lauren standing behind. Her, with the letter in her eyes, being Amalia, clearly stepped back and stated, "I'll see you at the altar," in a voice that even. For the first time, Daniel paused and seemed unsure before nodding out. He answered, "Of course." But before he could say anything, Amalia stepped away and closed the door. She turned to Lauren, her heart thumping in her breast, and she said, "You don't." Lauren murmured softly, "You must do this." Amalia gulped, staring down at Knox's back muscles, and ears were still fixed on the door, nervous since she had no idea what the ceremony would be about to happen. Had started, the visitors were seated under the magnificent white rose canopy and golden lights, their whispers mingling with the gentle musical accompaniment. The aroma of newly cut grass and blossoming flowers permeated the evening in the background air, and for all those there, it was the ideal wedding location. With his hands clasped, in front of him the groom stood at the altar, radiating the customary. Amalia's pulse raced as she stood at the assurance that others anticipated from him. The garden's entrance concealed by the towering bushes separating her from the wedding coordinators, and her mother's words merged into the lengthy aisle that led to the altar. Background noise as they darted about her, fiddling with her gown's lace. To make sure everything was flawless, Lauren stood silently in front of her. But present, Knox sat with her eyes inscrutable and fixated on Amalia. Unlike the rest of the ceremony, Stone remained at her side, his gaze fixed on the sight in front of him. Celebration. He didn't care about the elegance of the decor, the beauty of the evening, or the flawlessness of when his body was still. His ears were alert, and each breath he took measured the music. Changed. This was her signal. She took a deep breath and moved ahead. As she passed through the entrance and into the aisle, the guests followed after her, the fabric of her dress trailing behind. Their expressions turned to her in amazement and respect as they rose from their chairs. She saw smiles, camera light flashes, and whispers amongst individuals about how stunning she was, and as her eyes locked with Daniel's, his grin warms as he watches her with the same effortless assurance. Everything about him appeared ideal, but she had a strong feeling that otherwise she could hardly see Knox's tension by her side. Prior to everything falling apart, Knox snarled and pushed forward. The song stuttered instruments as they tore through the air so fiercely that the visitors flinched. The wedding organizer stumbled and screamed as everyone gasped in surprise. Backward, his Knox scurried forward, escaping Amalia's hold, for a Daniel's face seemed to slow down for a split second before shifting his gaze. Expanded, not out of fear but more out of astonishment and rage. He hardly had time. to respond before the enormous German shepherd struck him with the entire force of his body, causing visitors to erupt in mayhem. As everyone rushed out of the confrontation, chairs crashed down and Amalia's mother gripped her, chest in dread as Lauren instinctively took a step toward Amalia, perhaps preparing for what was about to happen. Knox's snarls were savage, his fangs bared as he trapped Daniel as he struck the ground hard. The groom underneath him growled, his snout inches from Daniel's face. "Get that dog off him," the officer said, rumbling deep in his chest, stepped back in horror, his hands shaking as he held the book. Daniel fought under the hits, but the dog refused to change his stance, aggressive but restrained. While he hadn't yet bitten, his body was with his posture indicating to everyone that he would if needed. Amalia's breath paused in her. She was aware that Knox was acting aggressively, but this was more beyond that. Otherwise, he had been warning her for 4 weeks and had attempted to inform her for weeks. Daniel cursed as he pressed his hands on Knox's, something she refused to see. In an effort to push him away as soon as he snarled Knox's, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to bite, and his teeth gleamed in the gentle light of the wedding lights. Be freed. And Amalia saw the flash of it as Daniel battled. Something sinister in his face. The rage, the frustration, the fleeting moment. His mask just fell for a split second, giving her time to grab it, but it was sufficient to awaken her enough to allow her to see. Before Amalia could respond, Lauren moved, her voice piercing the background cacophony. When Amalia turned, Lauren was gazing at someone in the room rather than at her. A lady with a phone in her hands had forced her way to the front of the throng. Her demeanor was stiff, her face was pale, and her eyes were fixed on Daniel with clearly recognizable. The lady replied, "I need to talk to you," her voice trembling. Now, Amalia's security rushed in 2 minutes before they had chance to comprehend what was occurring. Knox resisted, but as soon as he was dragged back, guys seized him and pulled him away. Daniel sprang to his feet quickly and jerkily, wiping himself off. His whole manner had altered. His jaw was stiff, his shoulders were straight, and he had always had a laid-back appeal, but now Jesus Christ was gone, and he snarled his. The words struck her like a slap. "Therefore you need to put that dog down," turned to face him, hardly noting the way security kept back the knocks and scarcely heard the visitors whispering. Daniel was the only thing she could concentrate on because of the way his mask had. The lady holding the phone eventually broke it just enough for her to look through. You don't know who he really is." She came closer, her hands quivering, and unlocked the screen. The gathering grew still as she whispered, "Look at Amalia. You need to see this." As Amalia grabbed for the phone, her pulse pounded in her ears, and then as she looked over the letters and pictures, and there was no denying that she felt sick to her stomach. Daniel had lied, and it was more than a few little falsehoods or innocuous omissions. Even worse, the texts exposed a pattern of activity and fraud manipulation that went back many years, and Amalia wasn't the first. In fact, she wasn't even similar to. As she looked back at Daniel, a painful knowledge sank into her chest. His countenance had stiffened. He tightened his fists at his sides and saw the truth in her gaze as soon as she recognized. And he seemed terrified for the first time since she had seen him. Knox fought against he realized he had always known, the ideal security guard, and his growls rose once again. The guy she intended to wed wasn't flawless. He was a monster. And the air was heavy with disguise, and she had almost given him everything. Stress. The once beautiful wedding location with its golden draperies and immaculate white flowers had turned into a period of silence broken only by whispers. The visitor who had been seated once again rippled through the shocked gathering. Now they stood in tidy rows, their faces alternating between inquisitiveness and the aisle Amalia was meant to walk down seemed like a shock and a source of worry. Separating. Line before two and after the Daniel stood close to the altar, his suit a little rumpled from truth after truth. His hands were balled into fists at his sides as he was pushed to the ground. His eyes scanned the throng as if he was figuring out his next move, yet his jaw was tight. Was the calm, laid-back guy she had thought him to be, but his facade had broken, and Amalia saw for the first time that he wasn't the charming, Knox was a successful lawyer who had won her over, but he had spent his whole life in deliberate deceit. His body is still stretched against the two security guys holding him, and his loud growls are still coming as if Amalia's fingertips were as cold as ice. And he was the only one still acting, on the instinct he had understood long before she did. She felt the pressure of everyone's eyes on her as she clutched the phone the lady had handed her. She reacted as if the pictures on the screen were unquestionably legitimate emails and texts, records, demonstrating the manipulation of fraud and even prior interactions that had all ended in questionable ways, with ladies who had previously stood where she was now, holding on to the same meticulously constructed delusion, just till you don't comprehend Daniel's voice, so let it fall apart under them. Eventually, he broke through the cacophony with a forcefully calm tone. "This is a mistake?" His words hardly noted that flashbacks from the previous 2 years were repeating in her thoughts. Clarity was alarmed by the little discrepancies, since he had always avoided inquiries about his history by using evasive justifications and strategically positioned appeal that had drawn her attention away from the holes in his tale, which she had persuaded herself that it didn't matter if there were missing pieces in every relationship, fragments that she had so desperately wanted to believe in the dream that she had disregarded. Her heart thumped in her chest as she received warnings from KNX and her own intuition. She eventually answered, "I don't think it is." With a quiet but hard Daniel jaw, Amalia's grip tightened as she gazed at the lady who had handed her the phone. Her hands were still trembling in fear, and her eyes were flitting between Daniel and Amalia. Amalia questioned. The lady, as if she was afraid of what might happen next, took a deep collective breath and paused before agreeing. "I was supposed to marry him." Amalia's gut twisted as the throng rippled, and she already knew what I learned too late what the lady was going to say before she even uttered it. By the time I recognized him, the woman's voice had risen to little more than a whisper. She gulped, hard. "He's not who you are." And I had already lost everything. Believed that he remained silent since the gathering was weighed down by her comments like Amalia went back to Daniel in the oppressive fog. "Is this true?" he sneered, trembling. "This is absurd." His mind and his voice had become cold. "Now that he is losing patience, you will really trust what a lady says." A lady gave me a chill when he remarked, "You've never met over me." His voice had an edge and a harshness that had never been aimed at her before, or maybe it had been, and she just disregarded it, holding up the phone. "You have a." Daniel explained this by taking a step forward, and Knox immediately growled his. The security guy strained to restrain him as his whole body became stiff, his collar with tighter clutches, but his howls just deepened his hackles. Daniel, halted as his eyes flared, rose like a wolf eager to protect its pack. For the first time, Amalia saw doubt rather than guilt or regret, hesitancy. It was a sign that we're probably done here. Before she could even comprehend what she had just spoken, a murmur echoed through the audience, this time more loudly. While some visitors talked among themselves, others exchanged wide-eyed looks. "You're making a mistake," Daniel replied, his voice lowering as his expression darkened. Amalia raised her chin, saying, "No, I nearly messed up." The words felt weird and alien. She had spent the last 2 years persuading herself that Daniel was. She had allowed herself to have all she desired and had been waiting for. Surrender to the delusion of the meticulously manicured image of himself that he had shown to the world. But she wasn't the first. She had almost dropped to the bottom of a list of ladies She had lied, but now she went to Lauren, who had been. Her pal stood silently next to her the whole time, silently meeting her stare. Lauren offered Amalia the slightest nod in understanding, as she waited for her to speak the words that would put an end to this once and for all. Sighed, then turned to face Daniel again. The words, "I'm not marrying you," seemed like an avalanche last irreversible. Daniel's face became stern. However, he remained silent, which was defensible, and then he didn't say anything further. A few people gasped as he strode by them as he turned, on his heel, and left. His spine was stiff from the barely controlled rage, and he didn't look. He left the wedding, the lawn, and her life at that same moment. Knox released the tension in his body with a quiet, steady huff as he vanished from view, relaxed, and his ears perked up for the first time in weeks, as did his posture. Amalia exhaled shakily as she relaxed, and the visitors gazed in awe. Her mother was silent, waiting for anything to indicate what would happen next. Seemed heartbroken, but unsurprised that the officer stood clumsily at the altar. Looking between the deserted aisle and the guests' whispers, Lauren eventually shattered the quiet with a well-chosen statement. Remarked, slapping her hands together, "That was an incredible performance." A few apprehensive giggles then echoed through the audience. When the tension subsided, visitors started to mutter, with some shaking their heads in shock. Others nodded as if they had known something all along, while others warily walked up to her and offered quiet words of encouragement, while some just took a break since they were at a loss for words. Following the failed wedding, Amalia remained still. Her head was still spinning from everything that had just transpired, and she felt frozen. The rush, the surprise, and the knowledge of how nearly she had made the Knoxes leaning on her leg was the worst thing she had ever done. She ran a hand through his fur and pressed his weight against her, anchoring her. Lauren let out a shaky breath and grasped her arm. "Are you well?" Amalia nodded slowly, unsure if that was true or not, but for the first time in a long time she would feel happy that she had made the correct decision. Moment, she paid attention to the one voice that spoke instead of the cacophony or the expectations. Had been attempting to keep her safe the whole time, and Knox had known she should have listened before, but the important thing was that she had listened, now. Although there was less noise in the yard today, the traces of the mayhem were still there like a dents in the fog. Visitors had started to whisper their talks in small groups, uncomfortable and rife with rumors. Several people fled in a hurry. Others were unwilling to go in order to avoid the burden of what had just happened. Go as if anticipating a new development in the scene they had just seen. And IA stood still. She envisioned the train pooling at her feet like spilled silk as her hands gripped the delicate lace of her dress. 1,000 times before the event concludes, the procession down the... Despite the applause and excitement, she didn't feel joy as she walked down the aisle with her spouse. Mere fatigue, her limbs feeling as if they had been burdened by a lifetime's worth of work over the last several hours. Knox was. His body remained warm and firm against her side. His posture was no longer tight with aggressiveness, and he had quit snarling when grounding. However, he stayed alert, scanning the other visitors with his amber eyes. Every few seconds, as if to ensure he wouldn't, his eyes darted to the road Daniel had vanished down. Amalia hardly noticed her mother's arrival next to her, her face smeared with, for a long time, she expressed disappointment and relief from something else. Nothing, watching her kid as if her lips were pushed into a narrow line. You determined whether she was capable of handling what had just transpired. Amalia finally uttered the correct word, and she tightened her chest. "So why do I feel like I just ruined everything, but you almost did?" So her mother's face softened. Did she not look in the direction where the visitors were still chatting among themselves? It's a momentary jolt, but people will move on and forget, and so will Amalia wanted to think so. But in reality, she wasn't certain what going on, even if it seemed like Lauren was now on the opposite side of her. She thrust one of the 2 champagne glasses she was carrying into Amalia's hand. Without saying anything, she took a drink from her own glass, which was the most. "I once went to a ceremony when the groom's ex appeared, and it was the most emotional wedding I've ever been to." Amalia, who was pregnant, laughed dryly even though she didn't feel like laughing at. "Listen, I know this seems like the worst thing in the world, but Lauren shoved her. Right now, but let's face it, you avoided a full-on gunshot and a freaking rocket." Amalia looked at her lips as the life-destroying rocket exploded, pushing into a thin line. So why does it still seem as if Lauren's face has softened? Because it's intended to sting that you invested in something that wasn't genuine. The saddest thing about it was that she had spent 2 years establishing a future, with Daniel having faith in the self he had meticulously constructed for her. She had planned for their future together, trusted him with the... She didn't entrust certain aspects of herself to just anyone, and now they were all gone, broken in one night, and she gazed down at KNX, who was now, he had never trusted her, and as he sat at her feet, his ears were twitching. Daniel had attempted to warn her from the start, but she had disregarded his warnings. She knelt down and wrapped her arms around him when a lump appeared in her throat. "I should have paid attention to what you had to say." Knox's wide neck with her face hidden in his thick hair. He gave a gentle tuff and pressed his nose on her shoulder as she spoke. I hate to admit it, but Lauren was crouching next to her, rubbing behind Knox's ears. Amalia sneered. "No, you don't." And Lauren smiled. "That's great to hear." Amalia laughed shakily, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "But I'm saying it with love." The visitors were, as their voices faded into the night. Some of them offered her pitying glances, while others avoided eye contact. Complete lack of communication, as like they hadn't just seen the most embarrassing event of her life. Before leaving, the officer gave her a clumsy shoulder pat. Her mother moaned, and Lauren mumbled something about making calls to deal with the unavoidable fallout. Amalia stood with her arms outstretched over her head, staring at the flowers, decorations, and chairs that were left over after her disastrous wedding had been overturned in the confusion, leaving the almost empty champagne glasses on tables. She inhaled deeply, and Lauren nodded. "I think I need to get out of here." "Excellent, because I took a bottle of the good and instructed the caterers to box up some of the food." Amalia glanced at the champagne, "And you did what?" Lauren shrugged. "So I assumed if we're going to spend some time processing this mess, we may as well eat some good cuisine, and despite everything," Amalia felt the tiniest glimmer of a grin due to the booze. Pulling at the corner of her mouth, she turned to face Knox. "Are you game for some takeout? Decisions?" His ears pricked up, and she was certain that he understood all she was saying. Amalia found herself sitting on her apartment's floor after hours of yearning. She is still wearing her bridal gown, but she has taken off her hair and cosmetics. Lauren sat next to her legs, smeared from repeatedly scratching her eyes. In front of her she held a champagne flute in one hand and chopsticks in the other. Amalia's knee was sometimes prodded by the other KNX that was coiled up between them. "His nose," Lauren said. "How would you rate this bite of noodles on a scale of 1 to, 10? "At about 12, Amalia breathed. "Are you tempted to pretend to be dead and relocate to another country?" As expected, Lauren lifted her glass, and Amalia gazed at Neither of them was focusing on her bodily aches from the reality program on the television. Fatigue. But her thoughts continued to race, reliving every moment that had transpired. She was so certain about Daniel that she was certain of every decision she made. Lauren pushed Knox, who knew better, even if she had finally met the proper guy. "Hey, Amalia, you're going to be fine," Lauren murmured to her shoulder as she moved her head. "You will be, Amalia, even if your voice is quieter today. Maybe not tonight or tomorrow." She swallowed the knot in her throat, hoping that maybe, just perhaps, she threw the morning light through the partially open curtains. Discarded takeaway cartons from last night's spontaneous feast left gentle golden lines on the hardwood floor. A few crumpled napkins and an empty bottle of champagne were scattered on the coffee. The TV was still playing softly in the background, forgotten at the table. Amalia's feelings changed at some point throughout the night when she was finally overcome by fatigue. Knox was next, curled up with the weight of something warm against her side. His big head lying on her lap and his steady breathing were the only things that Lauren was stretched out on the sofa, one leg up, in the silent room. An empty glass that was still balancing dangerously in her fingers was dangling over the edge. Amalia gave herself permission for the first time since yesterday to now that the future she had imagined had been obliterated. Everything was altered. The illusion of security she had been living under for so long was destroyed in a single evening. She was left with nothing after believing in something that was never genuine. Despite her doubts, she absently brushed her fingers over Knox's thick fur. She was relieved that she wasn't experiencing the debilitating sadness she had anticipated, instantaneous and not overpowering. Yet it was there, under the fatigue. The life she thought she desired was gone. Daniel was gone, and that was okay somehow, and she moved a little so as not to wake KNS. She grabbed for her phone and saw that her screen was filled with missed calls from her mother, messages from worried friends, and even some media who had somehow learned about the grandeur of her wedding. She chose to ignore everyone instead of opened her photo album and scrolled through the images she had captured over the last several years. She smiled and posed for the ideal photos of her and Daniel at meals while on vacation, as they seemed to be the ideal pair during family get-togethers. But now she saw what she had never let herself to see before when she examined them. Distance in his gaze and the deliberate placement of his hands as he had constantly dominated the story, ensuring that everything seemed perfect. She had been so taken aback by She sighed deeply and cocked her head, pondering what their life may have been if she had disregarded the warning signals. Back, gazing up at the ceiling, it was odd how sadness operated on her, anticipated heartache, tears, and an intolerable feeling of loss. Yet all that was there was nothingness. And maybe that was Lauren's groaning from the sofa, moving as she covered her face with one arm, told me that we're not. Amelia, who was awake at the moment, gave a little weary chuckle. Unacceptably awake, Lauren muttered as she rubbed her eyes and then sat up with, God. It looks like we flung a sleepy sigh as she blinked at the debris around them. Lauren grinned at a celebration for making it through the worst wedding in history, background or anything like. Lauren briefly examined her with her customary keen how. Are you feeling, Amalia? I thought about it for a moment and it made me laugh. Lauren nodded approvingly, which indicates that your brain is functioning well. Is at last adjusting to reality. Daniel was a dead giveaway, to be honest. Amalia sighed. I should have worn sunglasses every time I saw you two together. You're free to be angry with yourself because you know she was, even if I can see it through her nose. And she was. But she was too exhausted to think about it at the moment, Knox said. Lauren shifted gently into her lap and gave a pleasant sigh while he slept. Amalia scowled. What's the plan? She put her foot with her own. Plan, huh? That's what you do when you decide you won't marry a phony and need to. Figure out what the question was. What the hell comes next? What happened next? She had long dreamed of living with Daniel in their house. All of everything was lost, including their future children and their well-planned lives. She acknowledged that she didn't know what to do for the first time in years. Lauren rolled her eyes after giving it some serious thinking. You never consider yourself. Perhaps it's time for you to do it first because it really got to you. Amalia had always been the one in charge, the one who planned, and the one who made every effort to ensure that everything went well. But she had never paused to consider what she wanted to shift the idea that maybe it was time to. She looked down at Knox, who had been her fulcrum throughout it all, and it was both horrifying and thrilling. I believe I only need some time to settle this and something within her, stated Lauren made an extravagant toast, lifting her glass of champagne from the previous evening. Amalia clinked her glass against Lauren to take a moment and avoid making a horrible life choices. Lauren grinned and said, We'll work on that one. They sat quietly. The burden of everything continued to weigh heavily on them for some time, although in some way, Amalia didn't know what happened, but it didn't seem as oppressive anymore. Following, but for the first time, she accepted that the days had turned into weeks. Something gentler started to emerge from the tumult of the botched wedding. The headlines became quieter, the whispers faded, and life continued on as usual. Amalia avoided making phone calls for the first several days because she was so exhausted, disregarding communications and refusing to discuss dancing in any way. Her mother cautiously skirted the subject in an attempt to check in, but Amalia Lauren had been her buffer, taking calls and preventing interruption while she wasn't ready. However, she was aware that Amalia couldn't remain in limbo indefinitely, and Knox never let her shadow stayed by her side and seemed lighter and less tense, as if his task had been accomplished, as if he had fulfilled his goal of protecting. She allowed herself to go through the motions, going for lengthy walks while knocking, perusing the city's bookshops and relaxing in coffee cafes without really intending to purchase anything, and, for the first time in a long time, seeing the world change around her was free of expectations, pressure, and plans, and that more than she had carefully planned her life for years, and anything that scared her would kill her. believed that she had put in a lot of effort, made thoughtful decisions, and followed the route. That had always been in front of her, but now that she was standing across from, she realized she didn't know who she had previously thought would be her future. One day, she was outside of it, lazily looking through her phone. She discovered that she was staring at an old picture of herself and Knox that had been taken. They were in an animal shelter years before to Daniel and all of this. She had volunteered there for a while and was surrounded by dogs of different sizes. Before life became too hectic, she had persuaded herself that she didn't have the time, but she felt something stirring within her as she looked at the picture for a while. She was standing outside the same shelter the next morning. The brick hadn't altered much. The somewhat worn sign above the entrance of the building was still there, with the smell of clean straw, and a lady at the front desk glanced up as the air was filled with disinfectant and the faint, familiar sound of dogs barking, smiled and said, "May I help you?" Amalia paused, feeling stupid for a moment, appearing without a plan, but before she could change her mind, she said, "I was wondering if you—" The woman's grin expanded as she said, "We always need volunteers." Volunteers? And Amalia began spending her days in the shelter. In first, she just spent a few hours there, sometimes assisting with dog walks, feedings, and cleanup. But she noticed that she was staying longer and lost track of time as the days went by. She didn't know she had been missing KNX until something settled in her chest. Was a regular there as well. The employees loved him, and the other dogs seemed to look up to him. He was compassionate with the nervous ones and patient with them for some sort of silent advice. One day, while she was wrapping up, the younger ones were constantly watching, always aware. When she arrived for the day, she passed a row of candles and paused, curled up in. There was an elderly golden retriever in the corner of his cage. His hair was speckled with, unlike the other dogs who excitedly sprang at the sight of Silver. His eyes were warm but exhausted. Upon seeing a guest, he only observed her with his tail wagging slowly. She bent down and pressed her fingertips on the metal as her heart tightened. "Bars, who is this?" she inquired, and one of the employees happened to step over. "He's been here for a long. Elderly canines are more difficult to locate." Fortunately, he raised his head. Amalia gulped past the knot in her throat as his deep brown eyes met hers gently. Her throat, understanding the sensation of being ignored and abandoned, she let out a breath. Even she was taken aback by the words. Yet as soon as she spoke them, the staff worker, nodded. "You want to adopt him?" After realizing they were correct. "Yes, I do." Lucky was first apprehensive about her and KNX, but within. After spending hours at home, he had become comfortable in the room, as if he had always belonged that evening when she sat on her apartment's floor, with Knox snuggled up next to her. She rubbed her fingers into Lucky's fur on her other side, feeling them. For the first time in weeks, she felt his chest rise and fall steadily, anything like tranquility after spending so much time lamenting an unrealized future. Sitting here now in genuine grief for a life that had never really been hers. Encircled by the peaceful solace of these two canines that entered her life for the same purpose but at separate periods. She came to the realization that she had regained her identity and acquired something far more significant. Perhaps it was the greatest thing that had ever happened to them.